Thank you very much, and a particular thanks to Sven for inviting me to be here this morning. It's a real honor, and I'm slightly humbled to be talking about this grand, really, and I mean it in a very positive way, this grand theme of mobilities. And I guess some of the humbleness comes that I have, in some ways, feel very personally related to the theme. I can't make entire sense of it at this point, but I know it really relates to something I feel strongly about. And there are two components which are very obvious. One is that I continue to have like almost a childlike fascination for movement, for things that move around, for transport, which probably informed very much what I decided to do professionally. And by sheer coincidence, the very location is also rather meaningful because it's just a few kilometers up the Schwäbische Alb, where I, as a teenager in the late 1980s, for the first time was allowed to fly a plane, a glider, by myself. So it is really sort of, there's something in the air around here. The other personal relationship with this theme is sort of the polar opposite end of mobility. So not the direct physical movement, not the transport side, but it's this notion of living in a cosmopolitan age and being a migrant. So I'm German, I grew up at Lake Constance, via Berlin, which was already a very big step, and a bit in the US. I ended up in London, and let's see how much longer I can end up living there, because the world is changing, as we all know. So there is this. And then my professional, I think, training actually allowed me to, or almost forced me to be quite critical of the term mobility in itself. And in some ways, maybe that's my contribution this morning. So if I wanted to intellectualize it, that's my pitch. What I have learned through my studies and research, and ultimately connecting with urban perspectives, is that in some ways what we want to achieve is something which is higher value than mobility. It's accessibility. It's being connected to each other, to ideas, and sometimes we may require mobility for that, but often in urban contexts it doesn't, and the core idea of the city is that it doesn't require mobility. And I try to make this case now throughout my talk, where I'm trying to connect the role of urban form, something which is rather static, in relation to then co-producing with, of course, transport issues of accessibility. And I also think that in particular this age of fascination with sharing and the new technological opportunities, that we may be at risk of missing the point about how cities and certain urban and built environments continue to lay the ground for a lot of the opportunities we have at the moment. In some ways, I want to bring it therefore back to that very question. So this is what I want to do this morning. Four relatively distinct topics. They will all relate to empirical work I've been doing with colleagues at the LSE in the Urban Age program, but also other research programs. It will be much more applied, less academic, or certainly sort of less theoretically informed than the brilliant talks I have attended so far here. And it will cover first issues of this co-creation of accessibility through urban form and transport systems. I will then look at existing patterns and trends, very important to recognize. And while in this very disruptive moment, the past may be able to tell us pretty few things about the future, I'm then specifically focusing on this term new urban mobility, which really captured the imagination of a lot of policymakers we are speaking to, and to discuss key determinants of that change, also introducing a few studies specifically on that issue which we conducted, and end up with the institutional dimension of better urban accessibility, which yesterday I attended the session on governance, was already very brilliantly addressed. So let's begin. And it's a provocation to start with a quote from an economist in this very audience, Ed Glaeser, well known to, I guess, those of you who work with cities. He's a Harvard economist who has been dedicating his life to understanding urban systems. And he said, cities exist to eliminate transport costs for people, goods, and ideas. You know, it's very simple. That's what cities are all about. Of course not. But he provokes something which reminds us of the very particular link between cities and transport. It's not just one of the many urban sectors. Transport is more intimately related to the city. And in some ways, if you want to put it in one word or sentence, cities are transport solutions. They offer us the opportunity to have access to each other. And cities have done this over the history through all sorts of different ways, but always related to transport innovation and technologies which have reshaped then the physical part of the city. This is all very familiar stuff to us, but I think it's important to rehearse. This is London, the Victorian London, the terrace house. Would have been impossible with a little cute train in the background, which enabled the horizontal development of the city. The turn of the last century is often described as the electrical era, the implementation in very dense, hyperdense urban context of introducing the streetcar and the elevator once again changed the city for good. It created a new urban fabric, very intimate relationship between transport systems and the built environment. And then, of course, an era of, transport technologies, a nexus between oil and the car, which, has led possibly to a form of urban development where the term city no longer applies. This is, of course, Los Angeles, and you can see that the logics of introducing the automobile to urban environments does leave very little breathing space to what is otherwise considered an urban condition. Interestingly is that we are today seeing a combination of all of those transport technologies still informing urban practice, co-producing together with urban form and these transport systems accessibility. So this is one extreme scenario. This happens to be in the suburbs of Los Angeles, where the sort of value proposition is one of enormous individual freedom at the level of your individual house, your plot, and the rest of the city you can only access by private car, and that's it. That's its inherent logic. And at the same time, and very much, sometimes even in the same city, you have developments which try to focus on physical accessibility still, which then enables, for example, here in Hong Kong, that on average residents in these blocks will access most of their daily needs within 5 to 10 minutes. For the work, it's 15 to 20 minutes. It's heavily public transport reliant. For sort of these longer trips, everything else is really walking. Now, there are compromises on the kind of living in these environments, and there's a real trade-off which people often choose, and that's important, between having enormous hyper-accessibility and maybe having smaller apartments, or certainly apartments rather than houses. What's interesting for all of us working in the practical side of urban development is to remind anyone who works in intervening in these systems of transport infrastructures on the one hand and the built environment of the city on the other hand, is that we are producing here, whatever we do, we're producing something which will be with us for a very long time. This term of path dependency comes to mind, and we have created this term of urban accessibility pathways. If you start from the walking city historically, depending on which route you go down towards either the car-oriented, more sprawling city or the transit-oriented dense city, that's something, once you've decided your direction, is incredibly difficult to then break. So you have an extreme condition of lock-in, far greater than any other policy sets we're talking about. Whether it's fiscal policy or policies around even big social reforms, by comparison, this is the stuff, the built environment, which is the hardest to change. Now, this is a cliche, but I think it's still important to show, and it's important to show you as a sort of informed academic audience to highlight that this is stuff which policymakers, when you talk to them, really get sort of informed by, and they feel this is a story I understand and I can see where the problem lies. So we're comparing here two cities, Atlanta and Berlin, similar size and population, and importantly, very similar in terms of wealth and GDP levels per capita. And you could argue quality of life sort of similar, although very different, but it's sort of at a certain level of affluence. But the physical fabric and the city system and sort of the accessibility is very, very different. So in Atlanta, in black, you have the built-up area, and superimposed in red, what is the rapid rail system, and the same for Berlin. Of course, extremely different, almost couldn't be more different. And the result of this is that in Atlanta you have less than 10% being able to walk, and I'm stressing being able to walk, cycle, and take public transport for most of the daily routines. It's a real limitation of freedom in many ways. In Berlin, actually by now this is more than 70% of Berliners walk, cycle, and take public transport. So there are choices, but very importantly, consequences, of course, of these built environment issues. Now, if we then jump to the environmental debate, it's usually then framed through how these transport patterns of moving about are sort of resulting in, for example, carbon emissions, directly dependent on, you could say, the performance of these individual modes in terms of energy consumption or carbon emission. I'm showing you this to make an important point, which is, as an urbanist, I'm not so much concerned about this, because we may be able to solve this. We may be able to even drive a Porsche Carrera GT with zero emissions if we were to have renewable energy and if it was an electrically car. But, you know, that's a big if. But the problem I'm concerned about is this one. It's the space consumption of moving people around in these vehicles. Again, a very strong hint at the issue where sort of the movement, the question of mobility, the question of transport and the built environment connect. If you move at a car at 50 kilometers an hour, our current sort of technological standards, you easily require 150, 160 square meters per person. Now keep in mind that even in the US, the personal living space per person across the country is 60 square meters. In the UK, it's 35 square meters. So quite frankly, it's completely and utterly ridiculous for moving people to require that much space. And it gets even worse. It's particularly ridiculous if you're trying to activate an urban economy like London, where you want to have densities of people coming together of 140, 150,000 people per square kilometer. Now, this is an economy which creates enormous wealth, a lot of it problematic as we're seeing, but the quintessential value proposition of bringing people together to think together, to gossip, to learn, and not only in closed offices and business parks, but on the street, in cafes, in pubs, and so on, is a very important story. And this is the story where tech is going at the moment. Silicon Valley is urbanizing. Silicon Valley is becoming Silicon Roundabout, as we call it in London, an urban neighborhood. So take these densities which workplaces produce very serious, because that's ultimately what creates sort of modern value creation. The problem we have in London is that we don't live like this. We live relatively dispersed, producing an enormous amount of movement and requirement for mobility. In fact, London has the longest commutes in terms of time and distance across the European Union. So accessing, once again, even if you have dispersed residential pattern, accessing your sort of hyper hub of economic activity in the following way is problematic, and we have always sort of discussed congestion as this abstract concept, and there are many technological ideas about how to make it more efficient and introduce telematics and better parking systems. No, the basic problem, if anyone is working in the industry, the basic problem is how much space the individual unit consumes. So this is what we really need to be working on if we are serious about the urban problem of automobility. So with that introduction, let me move to the actual patterns and trends we are seeing. And I think the main message here is one of possibly having to actively decide where we want the future to be rather than trying to predict it, because prediction is very, very difficult in this disruptive era. This allows me to come back to John Ury, who I had the pleasure meeting only a few times at conferences and a few social events after he published this book, After the Car, in 2009 with Kinsley Dennis. But I'm showing his book here because at the same time, another book was published by two US scholars, Daniel Sperling and Deborah Gordon, which was talking about 2 billion cars in the globe. At the moment we have 1 billion cars, and discussing how possibly could you introduce these 2 billion cars as part of a sort of sustainability drive. Now, in sort of more general talks, I present these two books as evidence that even academics can't agree. Well, we shouldn't say even. I mean, academics normally don't agree, but I think it's rather telling that there are really two very, very different perspectives on the future by four very eminent, very experienced scholars in transport thinking and theorizing. So this is the story on the one hand. There are a few things which we know more from technical exercises of predicting futures and looking at development. One of them has been pursued by Karin Seto at Yale. She is sort of a natural scientist, very much helping the IPCC with projections of global spatial development. Now, her work suggests that from 2000 to 2030, we're going to triple the amount of urban land in the world over this just period of 3 decades. So think of all urban land which we built up to 2000, and that amount is then tripled in just 3 decades. It's entirely insane in many ways, but this is what's happening. And we're halfway through this period, and managing that increase, if not ideally further reducing it, must be a number one priority, not only in relation to climate, but in relation to social policy issues and a whole range of other things, because of the lock-in. It's a one-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really determine futures for many urban dwellers, and then probably determine how cities and urban systems in the world will look like for a very long time. Now, interestingly, while the global story is difficult to accommodate with sort of an urban perspective, because it is so much about endless expansion, we have also seen since the 1990s a reversal of these trends. We have now in many OECD country metropolitan regions much stronger growth of populations in the core rather than in the belt, as you can see in this overview. Let's just look at Stuttgart. Well, even Stuttgart seems to have, according to OECD, stronger core growth than belt growth. And there's something happening with the very usage of the city itself, and I guess us overcoming a modernist ideal of functional segregation of the uses. Keeping in mind that this idea of how we distribute urban functions, of course, is once again another factor of accessibility. What I'm showing you here is a comparison between 2 neighborhoods, one in London, one in Berlin, similar distance to the city center, mapping out the ground floor uses other than residential. Everything in black is residential. The colorful one is shop services, institutions, and so on. And what I'm going to propose here, and we have new and fresh evidence, that the way neighborhoods are currently developing, fortunately, is not like we're seeing it here in London, where within these urban neighborhoods, it's very monofunctional, mainly because it's the terrace house, but that the Berlin model, a rather historic model of mixed use of the famous Berlin block, the perimeter block, is gaining a lot of traction. Is also becoming, in some ways, what the market demands, because consumers, or better word, urban residents, actually have a new appreciation for this kind of accessibility to your doctor, to your school, to services, and so on. Often in the ground floor even of your very building. So this is co-location, very effectively. And this is where architecture becomes transport. These architectures of a city, I guess we all share a certain affection with, have really produced accessibility for, let's leave aside the job. Jobs are important and the commute are relevant, but actually most cities is 20-25% of the overall sort of flows in a city. But for all other flows, the kind of proximity created by mixed use is of enormous relevance. And this is what architecture can do if designed properly. Let's move to mobility in a more narrow way. Let's have a look at these projections by the International Energy Agency on the growth of motor cars. Now, this is an older projection, 2008, but it assumes on the basis of past trends and how GDP growth correlates with car use growth and car ownership growth. It just then extrapolates the past into the future, and we'll end up with 3 or more than 3 billion cars in this world by 2050. Now, this is not going to happen, I'm very confident, because it's such a simple mistake that's being made here. But what is important to acknowledge is this is how a lot of the companies very close by calculate what the product will be and the demand will be for their product. And this is sort of the statistics. They then go to Indian cities like Mumbai and Delhi, and sometimes being, I guess, disappointed that growth is fast and rapid, but maybe not as rapid as expected. Now, if we are uncertain about sort of futures, it's very helpful to look back in the past. And what I'm showing you here is sort of a very schematic perspective of how urban transport modes in the UK developed over time from the 1900s onwards, and how we would probably have made massive prediction mistakes if we were in this very early period of the 20th century and had argued the train is the future and only the train. Because what came, of course, was the bus and the tram, which in many ways outcompeted the train, and what then came was the motor car. It's, I think, relatively clear that the car will not be the exception, the one thing that prevails in its current form forever, but that technology will once again offer alternatives. And maybe, at least in a sort of more sort of social environment and how societies respond to the very product of travel and owning vehicles, we're already seeing these disruptions happening. And once again, our inability to accommodate these predictions in our projections. So here we have vehicle miles traveled for the United States, and then a range of estimates by the US DOT, the Department of Transport. And you can see how miserable their efforts are to predict what is the black line, the actual behavior. So all the colorful ones are the working assumptions on which you spend budgets, develop projects, make propositions to the market about how important it is to invest in infrastructures and indeed vehicles. So lots of disruption, and a wonderful example of disruption is this product. This is a photo of one of the very first mountain bikes, which was used in the foothills just north of San Francisco in the early 1980s. And some people who have looked into the rediscovery of cycling would argue that it was the mountain bike that really started the reinvention of this very successful transport technology. And it is through that new appreciation as a leisure activity that it once again became a very important factor in urban transport in OECD country cities, less so, of course, in the emerging economies. And even the most fiercest advocates of cycling would have never predicted the enormous increases of cycle activities in these cities. Now, a lot of this is by design and intention, but the scale to which even in London we are seeing increase in cycling, I think has not shocked, but in a very positive way shocked its advocates. Now, why is it so disruptive at the moment? Well, there's the technological narrative. We have already seen yesterday sort of references to these sequences of past technological innovations, and each of them, as I've shown at the beginning, have altered the city considerably, and in some ways even questions its very sort of physical makeup. Now, we are at this interface of two revolutions, the information and telecom revolution, where we're just about able to get a sense of what is happening, but really not. And then a clean tech and efficiency revolution where a lot of big questions are open, because this still depends so much on global political will. And even we have the Paris Agreement, there are enormous uncertainties. But if this were to kick off along the lines of Paris, it's going to be yet another revolution mapped onto the information and telecom story. And how disruptive this could be if we were to take it serious, we're probably by now more and more familiar with those ideas, but one early exercise of thinking about the transport systems and what would happen if you introduced, for example, shared vehicle mobility on demand systems to a city like Singapore, and this is a study by MIT. The suggestion was that you could actually reduce the current number of vehicles in circulation by 2/3, so you only need 1/3 of these vehicles, to have full mobility, even the mobility which is currently on public transport. Now, you don't want to do this, but it gives you a sense of the enormous efficiency gains you could have if we start sharing these bloody cars. Talking about sharing, there's one reflection about this term. When you come to this as an urbanist, you often wonder, how do we differentiate sharing from public? And there's one thing you often realize, and you feel like, okay, the very notion of sharing is quintessential the urban logic. So we come together to share resources, to share the same public space, and we call it public space. Maybe that's a discussion we can also have, but I think for me the boundary between public and shared isn't as crisp. Now, think of replacing parking in cities. I recently visited Kuwait. This is a photo I took from my hotel window. You can redesign the city. I mean, it's going to be heaven for architects to really rethink these environments once you no longer need the space for parking. This is the inner city, by the way. And yes, you'd say it's a hot climate and you can't walk around. Well, not true, because if you go there at the moment, it's rather pleasant for more or less 6 months, and would be a delight to have walking environments as they had in these places before the modernist ideal hit the ground. Now, a lot is discussed and proposed, and big money is going into all sorts of new ideas. I think one of the biggest mistakes is to continue thinking about the design of individual vehicles, and then you call it electric car or autonomous car, and not appreciate that this technological moment allows us to conceptually rethink the very foundation of the design of this car, and completely blur the difference between different size vehicles, how you couple them, and I think these are discussions which need to be opened up. But most importantly, and I said it so many times already, we need to move away from personal ownership. And maybe even here technology will help us, because even if you're going to own it personally, if you're then sort of left with the choice of just parking your car or allowing your car to be driving for the day and doing sorts of deliveries and maybe helping people and making money, you may actually end up using your privately owned car as a little sort of money machine during the day rather than having to stand around. So it's going to be interesting. But I want to talk about trends and patterns that are currently happening. And in this regard, it's important to still recognize that globally of these sort of different decisions and opportunities and their spatial impact, the world is shifting to the left. And usually this is framed on the basis of, well, this is what people want. They love to drive, they like it, they appreciate it, it's consumer will. I think what's forgotten in this context is the extent to which policy distorts these decisions, and to what extent particularly national policy, even in this country, with all its sustainable transport ideas, is at the national level still very much concerned about making consumers make this very choice towards the automobile. So there's no consumer sovereignty, there's no cost-based pricing, obviously, and no policy neutrality. A wonderful summary of that bias can be seen if we look at the UK and the real cost of motorized transport in relation to income. The only way of moving motorized that became cheaper from 1997 to 2009 was driving a car. So it's actually it's a surprise that we have seen sort of the sustainable mobility shifts, which I'm going to come to in a moment. So at the countrywide level, this is now an overview for selected EU countries and the modal split or share, how it changed from 1990s or early 1990s to the more recent periods. In most countries, we still see an increase of car use. We do see this. But at the same time, and this is becoming now the interesting story, certainly the bigger cities are all going the polar opposite direction. We are seeing something which maybe also politically is going to be problematic, where cities in their lifestyles, in their way of thinking, and urban residents decouple from the rest of the country. And transport, urban mobility, is just one of those areas. Now, one of the reasons why this is happening, why the city is decoupling, is the most basic logic of the city, which is to share space and to be spatially more efficient. So what you have here for a whole range of countries is the different space use, which is square meters per inhabitant for cities in red, for towns and suburbs in yellow, and then for rural areas in green. So it is the spatial efficiency of the city which enables a lot of the stuff that is currently happening, and I think this is important to consider. Let me now come to new urban mobility and what we can regard as the determinants of change. The first thing to say is that in urban studies and urban policy making, transport is often celebrated as an area of great intervention and innovation and change, not only in all these different cities and in these individual cases, but all of them also stand for a much more general global change, often inspired by those individual cities. So they're innovating not just locally, but then for a global audience of mayors and urban citizens. What we mean by new urban mobility is, on the one hand, a new appreciation of accessibility, i.e. having density, having mixed use, having opportunities for co-location of different opportunities. But on top of this, the rediscovery of walking and cycling, which we're seeing in many places, then the sharing of transport, electric mobility and multimodality. These last three much more enabled directly by the digital opportunities. And very objectively, things are happening and changing in that regard. And not only this conference is evidence of this, but if you look at how some of these ideas which have been around for a long time, like car sharing, and I know Bert Kanzler was one of the innovators of this very early when I studied even in Berlin. He was the big reference to thinking about how you can introduce a much better sort of shared car system in the city of Berlin. But it took until technology was really able to make it efficient to now scale it. It's happening now. And the same is true for, again, using, for example, buses in a more efficient way, where in London, in some ways, you no no longer need bus stops because you know exactly real-time data when your bus is going to arrive, making it hugely attractive. But what are the factors that it's happening now? Well, there is not a single one you could easily sort of refer to. I think policy intervention is often one that is forgotten or not stressed enough, that there's a very conscious sort of by design perspective on how we would like and need to change developments. And then there's a long list of different factors, of which I'm of course very interested in urban change, what is happening much broader in terms of people reappreciating what is an urban condition rather than a suburban or more rural condition. There's technology, there are all the attitudes around car ownership, some of them John Ury captured very well in his work. Now we took on the challenge with InnoZ in Berlin to understand a bit better for London and Berlin how the very basic mobility attitudes inform mobility behaviors. It's a field of study which is fairly established, as you can see here, by numerous publications, but we felt we wanted to do it in a very comparative way across to countries and cities. So we embarked on a comparative study based on a household survey in the metropolitan regions of London and Berlin to not understand how people move about, but how they actually embrace and like different kinds of movement. And we created what we called a sort of urban mobility attitude groups. And the ambition here was to maybe get a better understanding how on the basis of these attitudes we may project how future behavior change can materialize if facilitated by policy. Now London and Berlin are interesting because a lot of change happened there, more extreme than even in the other cities I have shown you. This is 1998, the modal split. Look at in particular how the grey car use and motorcycle use component dominated still in the late 1980s, 90s, and how that considerably reduced over only a period of 15 years. In Berlin, a lot of it went to walking and cycling. In London, a lot of it to public transport. Let me just go back and forth and you get a bit the idea. We have seen declining road traffic, not only in the inner city, which you have here in red for London, but across a metropolitan London. And these are really interesting conditions, and I stress many people are still not entirely understanding what is happening here. So we conducted this survey and then were able to segment the urban societies in the two cities into 6 relatively clear subgroups which have very similar attitudes towards mobility. The question to what extent they like cycling, driving, sitting in a train and so on were all determinants of these accessibility groups. A few observations. The first one, look at the pink one, the traditional car, this is not really pink. I mean this one, I don't know what's the color here on the purple, yes. The traditional car-oriented. A big surprise for us how in the metropolitan region you had actually a relatively small share of people who would not accept any alternative to driving. They simply wouldn't. So if you wanted to intervene here, you really had to talk about electrification, if anything. But if you talk to policymakers, the natural assumption is that this is your majority and you're really worried about them because you don't want to talk about parking space reduction and any of these things. And interestingly, the amount of people who are embracing more innovative, technology-oriented opportunities is very high in both cities. And I think I should stress this is now Berlin. What was also interesting, how similar these two contexts are. So an interesting breeding ground for, of course, changing not only then future attitudes, but certainly behaviors. And to give you a bit of a sense how distinctive these groups are, here a whole range of measures with regards to sort of mobility preferences, like cycling, public transport, all the way down to also embracing technology for what we call the traditional car-oriented. So across all those sets of people, how they felt about it, and then you compare that to the innovative access-oriented, you really understand how different people think and how different people's attitudes are across those groups. Again, I'm going back and forth. I'll skip this because obviously on the basis of these behaviors and attitudes you can then create policies, but that's maybe for another session. What is important is to recognize also where these people live, which brings me back to space. So this is where the traditional car-oriented are, people who have attitudes about the car, not about the actual practice. But it is aligned with, I guess, more suburban lifestyles. And very extreme, particularly in London, the innovative access-oriented, how much they concentrate in the very inner city. So it's not a surprise that now, if you look at how London has changed physically, how it has built up its inner, more compact urban territories oriented to public transport, that it has therefore led to the kind of mobility change we are seeing. So do not divorce mobility from the spatial fabric, I think, is the key message. Of course, besides that, massive public transport infrastructures, investments in these cities, which are important to consider. Now, I see a lot of you watching, checking out the watches. I hope I'm not yet overdoing, but I want to give you a sense of the institutional dimensions which can deliver this better urban accessibility. And in some ways, this also has, and it was said yesterday, a lot to do with this idea of sharing or co-producing. Because in, I guess, political science, there's this idea of governance, of really being able to bring many more stakeholders to the table to co-create these systems. You need different professional perspectives, but a whole range also of perspectives from within society to become better at designing these future cities. And I want to give you a bit of evidence of what we actually know about this co-creation, and also where maybe what has happened, particularly in London and Berlin, is a bit counterintuitive. I'll start with a very concrete example, just to give you the sense of the complexity we're talking about. This is a summary of all the e-mobility actors in Berlin, from the state to different kind of private corporations, publicly owned companies, universities, and so on, mobility providers. Orchestrating these is a complex task. But turns out that from our evidence in different parts of the world, we know that cities are relatively good, and by cities I mean urban governance, of starting to orchestrate these groups because they know them intimately, and this is what Berlin has set up with its various initiatives to, in some ways, bring the orchestra together. I'm not commenting on how successful or not, I'm just making a point that if you want to pursue these things, you need to, in some ways, provide this integration service and orchestration. The term that's currently probably of the highest sort of currency in this context is integration, and it has been for a long time. Integrated policy making, integrated planning. In October this year in Quito, we launched the new urban agenda, and if you do a word search for different sort of key policy concepts, integration is very much out there. But the term is also one which desperates us, because we have been trying to integrate for such a long time, and what has actually happened. I'll come to that a bit more. But the important message is that once again, with the SDGs, with the goals as part of the new urban agenda, integration is going to be a very central theme for the next 10, 20 years of urban thinking. Now, in transport, what this requires is not to only move from sort of traditional transport, single mode planning to multimodal planning, integrated transport, but to embrace accessibility planning, to embrace the placemaking component. That makes it even more complicated. But the city, unlike many other tiers of government, are probably the only hope we have in that regard. National policy is awfully siloized and sectorized. Even within transport, you usually single out policy around road transport, rail, airports, and so on. Legal texts are very dispersed. But cities, given their very good understanding of their functions and their integrated functions, at the moment at least try as good as they can to bring together how you design design densities and bring together mixed use in relation to transport infrastructure, to then at a more local implementation scale, of course, bring it back to very concrete disciplines, delivery packages of co-producing accessibility, as I refer to it. Now, how is this done and what are the big barriers? Well, just to give you one very big barrier, the metropolitan region and its gap with regards to what the political city is. Here are a few extremes. In red, political cities, in grey, what is considered the actual functional urban region, rarely maps onto each other. So you need to have enormous coordination mechanisms across the metropolitan region. In fact, Stuttgart is one of those examples where with a even elected regional authority, you have a very innovative case. But let's move on. And the first question is actually, if we now look specifically at transport planning and spatial planning, to what extent is actually government in charge? This is a result, I'm showing you 3 slides, which looks at a global survey of city governments, about 100 worldwide, to really capture what's common practice and how do cities locally assess the involvement of themselves, but also of other governments. Spatial planning is probably the most public sector-led policy area we know of, we work with, but even transport is still very dominated by the public sector compared to housing, economic development and others. So then let's now ask about which level of government is actually leading these policy sectors. Now anything in red here refers to the city, metropolitan or below city level. The grey are other tiers of government. And again, the hierarchy is from the most urban control to the least urban control. Spatial planning, culture, utilities, and then urban transport, once again, are areas which are heavily dominated by the urban. That's an opportunity. It does allow us to map this onto the integration story I sort of introduced. But urban transport, unlike spatial planning, is tricky because once you go inside the box of urban transport and you disaggregate the different responsibilities of transport, you realize that it's hyper multiscalar. There are areas, particularly heavy transport infrastructure spending, entirely controlled often by nation states, and there are other areas which sometimes even the boroughs or sort of sub-city level control. So you can't get away from dealing with this multi-scalar issue. Now I want to give you, and this is where I then end, just a flavor of what have London and Berlin done institutionally to enable the kind of change I have shown you before. We have seen a lot of change. We know that a lot of this is related to society and societal changes, but something also happened, and it is quite interesting, within the formal institutional framework. And it begs the question to what extent this is sort of based on a more hierarchical system of decision-making or a more networked form of decision-making where different actors come together. And I'll end with that. So we have seen the integrated ideal, which I'm superimposing here on top of the internal staircase of the new City Hall in London, which was introduced in 2000. But let's start with Berlin, which for a long time, this is sort of a very basic outline of how Berlin is governed and its department structures. There's a very interesting role of one department in particular, which took off in the late 1990s, an integrated department for urban development, transport and the environment, which brought together for the first time at that moment a whole range of departments that before were actually competing against each other and not talking to each other, often also divided politically. So that story of an integrated super ministry and department actually has come up in many sort of investigations, but has been a critical factor in Berlin. Up until recently, this changed only with the last election in October. This is how this department was structured and was really trying to make an attempt of bringing together under one senator this thinking about transport and spatial development. And it was an attempt which was, at least internationally, very much recognized and discussed. London had a very different story. London basically didn't have a citywide government from 1985 to 2000. And then you can see this big hole here. And then we introduced a completely new paradigm of running the city, of which a few factors were central in relation to the mobility revolution we have seen in London. One is that transport was directly under control of the mayor for London. In fact, it was the one area, together with spatial planning, where the powers were most significant. And within transport itself, a major reform took place. This is how transport, urban transport, was governed up to 2000. It was a mess, a multi-scalar mess, with little pockets of departments, technocracy, dealing by themselves. And by the introduction of Transport for London, for the first time, and it's still one of the few departments in the world where you have all means of travel considered under one roof, from the bus to the bike, from driving all the way to walking, and of course the tube. This has had a major influence on how London was able to then really shift gear into a direction, as Ken Livingstone stated. I was able to push TfL into every direction I wanted and in this case it was the direction towards more sustainable transport. Now, what is for social scientists and political scientists maybe a bit irritating, that what London has essentially done, and to an extent Berlin, is to reintroduce hierarchy and centralized control to do this. It's actually only in parts a networked story. The main story is one of centralized control, and then with a lot of political leadership backed by I guess, legitimacy through a political system to move in this direction. So hierarchy is actually the stronger word which has emerged in this context rather than networks, and nevertheless, within the shadow of hierarchies, a lot of networking takes place. Different actors talking to each other more than ever before, and the history of a lot of the personal history of a lot of people involved in these hierarchical systems is much more diverse. We have at TfL people who started their career as activists in the streets to allow for better cycling to happen. I'll jump this, but I'll end with 4 slides, things I haven't talked about at all, and I think which is lurking big time in the background. I have no idea how sort of these more technocratic observations I have maybe shared up until now deals and relates to this new political landscape. But then there are also a few more subtle questions, I think, which we need to address. How we can make the strategic thinking of urban development more collaborative hasn't been solved properly. This is an image of the Stadtforum in Berlin, which in the 1990s tried to do this, sort of reasonably successful, but there isn't a formula out there. We're also seeing a very new tendency towards re-municipalization, even in London, even in neoliberal London, can you imagine, where the public transport provider, Transport for London, is now taking over what used to be privately owned rail operators. That's a new opportunity, and in most cases is nowadays associated with greater efficiency rather than less. So very, very interesting to discuss. And finally, there's a lot about digital era governance, which will enable that future more integrated and then maybe more networked thinking of co-creation for urban accessibility. Thank you very much.
I think we have about 15 minutes for questions, if anybody wants to ask a question.
Kuznetsov Andrei from Tallinn State University, Novgorod State University. I was really struck by your idea that the way to sustainable new urban transport or mobility is passing the hierarchy and centralization. And the opposite idea that the centralized and hierarchized systems are not sustainable. So how it could be? What is the risks of oligarchy in that solution? And what if some transport Trump take the power in this department and start promoting not car sharing but just cars, individual, and some ideology to make it to the ignorant urbanite or whatever. Yeah. So it seems like. This is a really risky solution, centralized department.
Shall I respond directly or wait?
No, absolutely.
Yeah? Well, thank you for this question, because I think it allows me to clarify a few things. First of all, I'm not for a moment suggesting that on the basis of this evidence you want to do anything, but I think it's important to consider this observation. It's very important that you differentiate institutional structures and frameworks and to what extent they enable whatever, and then political intent. And of course, political intent remains enormously important. But once there is a political intent, the delivery mechanism still matters. And what I was saying, that both in London and Berlin, rather than just this becoming a complete sort of network exercise of people sort of tweeting and, you know, being sort of co-creating at the level of, you know, like architects often dream about new architectures. We talk about big, heavy infrastructure, and in some ways the urban transport revolution, certainly in London, to a lesser extent in Berlin, entirely relied on a new form of, at the city level, centralized control and centralized management with these oversights and with these efficiencies you have. And I think this is, I know exactly, it's a provocation, but I think we're also seeing in management discourses, we're seeing this in public administration, that this conventional duality between hierarchy and network, or sort of treating it as polar opposites, network and hierarchies, is actually not mapping onto the reality. We need to understand much better what is, for example, happening in the shadow of hierarchy. And this is the one thing where I would say, if there was a change in London now with a very sort of anti-cycling person, what would be difficult is to turn the system around immediately, because you have these fine-grained working groups, people with very normative ideas, deeply embedded as network actors within the hierarchy. So in that sense, you couldn't quickly turn it around. It's a combination of the two.
I have two questions. On one hand, how do you came to these figures, to these percentages, which authority or competence is on what policy level for the different areas? Because looking on that, I was a bit confused. I see, for example, a lot more which is in the background regulated due to, for example, European primary law, who has this idea of a common European transport area, and this is going back to the late 60s, 70s when it came in the treaties. This is one question. So I'm not very convinced on that. So, but maybe you can explain a bit more. And the second thing, this was an observation I made in Quito as well at the UN Habitat conference. I had a bit the impression that you have now these new actors like Transport for London, such type of agencies, which are not really governmental or something in between, or they are governmental in a way, but in another way. And I had the impression, is this the right way? Because with all these agencies and the projects done in cities and all the NGOs and all the players involved to do projects, to get funding and financing for the projects by development banks, you may lose the capacity at the governmental side. So that actually it gets marginal what the elected city government is deciding and planning, because you have now this, in a sort, public-private partnership agency who is doing everything. Is this the right way? I had a bit the impression at UN Habitat that it goes in the wrong direction, that we have a huge machine of actors who want to get funding and financing for their projects and their ideas, and then the projects are finished and okay, this is the end and the next project is coming up.
Yeah. Thank you. So a methodological clarification for this global survey, which we actually conducted with UCLG, United Cities and Local Governments, and UN Habitat, where we approached, I mean, sort of in total it's several hundred cities, but the one I show you here to keep it representative is this sort of subset where per country we didn't include more than 2 cities. So to have a bit of a clear sort of global, nationwide perspective. It's global data, it doesn't relate to the EU. I'd say maybe there are 30% of EU cities included, and it's based on how the city perceives this power relationship. So we formally engage with city governments and sort of the key officials to ask them how would they rate sort of the influence, the power distribution across first public, private, third party and so on, but then most importantly in relation to the different tiers of government. So it's a perception-based survey. It's not based on taxation or how much money is spent here and there. In relation to your second question, the Transport for London is a fully public agency. There's nothing private about it. It's entirely, these are civil servants in some ways. You could argue that, you know, in spirit it's a bit run more like a private organization with the kind of incentives and the pay, very high level of pay as it happens. It's entirely under the control of an elected government. In fact, the Mayor of London, a directly elected mayor. And I think actually, if anything, synchronize quite well with what sort of the UN Habitat story is, and also what synchronizes well with maybe these critiques about endless partnerships and particularly sort of private sector deals, because given their power and their sort of centralization, they are able to really keep the private contractors under control. And if anything, often the private contractors complain and they say they are so overpowering, their systems are so detailed, I can't make any profits anymore. So they have really squeezed this system in, I think, favor to the public in a very interesting way.
I've already collected 2 more.
I'm Vibeke Nense from Transport Research Institute in Oslo. I have a question. Thank you for a highly interesting talk about, and with your strong argument about urban structure matters. But I was wondering if you have a comment on this tension between what we could call architectural determinism, urban structure matters totally, or on the other side, many social scientists have this, it's urban residents who in a way have self-selected them into more sustainable mobility. Do you have a comment on this tension?
Yeah. No, so I think I wouldn't consider myself, obviously, with this audience as a sort of spatial determinist, but I would argue that what I have seen also at a very personal level with how people change behavior is that I get the argument of self-selection. Let's start here. But there have been very sophisticated studies which control for self-selection, so the fact that certain people with certain attitudes just happen to be in downtown areas. And even if you control for self-selection, you get different behaviors seemingly to depend not only on density, and this is important, but a range of different factors. But I think what we underestimate is the extent to which our physical environment and our routines not only shape behavior, but in the long term how this shapes attitudes. You become different on the basis of how you live in your daily routines. And in that regard, living in a very sort of hyper-cosmopolitan, multicultural, public transport, street-oriented context will make you, after 30 years, a different person compared to living in a very sort of monofunctional, suburban, exclusive environment. And I think I'm most interested in that question. And I'm not the type of social scientist who could properly contribute to this debate. Colleagues of mine at the LSE who work in sort of behavioral economics try to address this to an extent, and that's a very particular and also heavily critiqued approach. But I think there is something for the more critical social sciences to contribute to this question. And I would also add, because it also links to this question, how much demand, how much do people actually in Britain constantly want to live in flats? And sort of the basic assumption is people want to live in houses with gardens. Well, one way of interpreting how the house price landscape looks like, and if you consider that as an expression of where people want to be, we clearly seem to have undersupply of the kind of hyper-urban, mixed-use, even apartment, family-friendly, good quality of life environments. So if anything, I think intuitively, the message would have to be that's what we need to build, and we shouldn't build a single detached family house. I mean, it's radical, but that's a bit what I would propose, and with a group like this one.
Okay, one final short question, I think. Somebody in. No, okay. We're going to their education.